Some stories are not written in books. They are carved into stone. This is the story of a man with no wealth, no power, and no machines. A man the world forgot until he did the impossible. He lost the love of his life, and from his pain, he built a path. This is not just a story. This is a lesson, a legacy. This is the story of Dashrath Manji, the man who moved a mountain. In the eastern heartland of India, where the sun bakes the earth and the wind carries the scent of dust and dreams, there lies a small, forgotten village, Galar. Nestled in the rugged terrain of Bihar, Galar was a place where time seemed to move slower. The days began with the crow of roosters, the clinking of bangles, and the soft hum of morning prayers. Children played barefoot on cracked soil. Farmers worked from sunrise to dusk, their faces weathered by years of toil, yet lit by quiet resilience. But behind the warm smiles and simple lives, there was a silent enemy, the mountain. Towering and unforgiving, this massive ridge of stone loomed over the village like a curse etched into the landscape. It wasn't just part of the scenery, it was a sentence. The mountain stood directly between Galar and Vajirganj, the nearest town, where hospitals, schools, and markets existed. But with no roads piercing the rock, villagers were forced to take a treacherous 70-kilometer detour. What should have been a 10-minute journey became a 2-day ordeal. People suffered in silence. A sick child had no chance of reaching help in time. Expectant mothers walked for hours in pain, only to collapse before they could see a doctor. Families carried the dead on their shoulders for burial in the next village, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. And yet, no one came to help. No one paved a road. No official, no minister, no outsider cared. To the rest of the world, Galar did not exist. The mountain became more than just a physical barrier. It was a symbol of neglect, a daily reminder that the poor were left to fend for themselves. And so, the people of Galar lived behind that wall, disconnected, dismissed, and forgotten. Until one day, a man named Dashrath Manji looked up at the mountain, not with fear, but with fire in his eyes. He didn't have money, he didn't have power, but he had something stronger. He had a reason, and that reason would turn into a legend. On the other side of the mountain, there was life, a town called Vajirganj, where roads were paved, shops were stocked, and help was never too far away. People went about their business, children ran to school, doctors treated patients, and trains came and went, as if the world was whole. But back in Galar, the villagers could only watch that life from a distance, as if staring through a locked window into a world they weren't allowed to enter. The mountain wasn't just an obstacle. It was a border between two realities, one of opportunity and one of oppression. To reach Vajirganj, the villagers had to take a brutal path more than 55 kilometers long, on foot, through forests, across dry riverbeds, over sharp rocks, under the burning sun. And they didn't walk this path for adventure. They walked it for survival. A child with a fever? That was a 2-day journey. A woman in labor? She had to pray the baby waited. A snake bite, a broken bone, a sudden accident could all mean a death sentence. Sometimes they started the journey with hope. Sometimes they ended it with a body on their back. And when someone died, a mother, a father, a child, there was no ambulance, no last-minute rescue. Just the silence of the mountain, cold and unmoving. People begged for a road, for help, for anything. But the mountain stood still, and so did the world. Every morning, as the sun rose behind the ridge, the people of Galar were reminded of everything they were missing: education, healthcare, dignity. It wasn't that they didn't want a better life. It was that life itself had been placed just out of reach. Children grew up learning not letters, but hardship. Young men left the village, chasing jobs in faraway cities. Women aged before their time, worn down by labor and loss. And still, no road came, no engineer came, no government worker came, because in the eyes of the world, a village like Galar didn't matter. But in that forgotten corner of India, there lived a man who refused to accept that fate. He was poor, he was a laborer, but his will was made of iron. Dashrath Manji had seen what the mountain had taken, and soon he would begin his answer, not with words, but with a hammer and chisel. The world may have turned away, but he was just getting started. Before he became a legend, before the world called him the Mountain Man, he was just a name spoken softly among the fields of Galar, Dashrath Manji. To most, he was invisible, a man from a poor family, born into the lowest caste, given no power, no platform, and no promise of a better life. He had no land to call his own, no rich relatives, no political connections, just bare feet, blistered hands, and a relentless will to survive. Each morning, as the sky began to glow, Dashrath walked out into the fields, sometimes with a worn shovel, sometimes just with his bare hands. The sun would rise high, burning the backs of the farmers. But Dashrath kept working, sweat pouring down his face, clothes soaked, hunger gnawing at his belly. But he never stopped. He was one of thousands, laborers bent over fields, laying bricks, pulling carts. But there was something different about Dashrath. He moved with purpose, he spoke with fire, and he carried pain like it was fuel. He knew the weight of poverty, the kind that doesn't just live in your stomach, but in your bones, in your soul. He had seen loved ones go without food. He had seen children cry for medicine that would never come. He had seen people die not from disease, but from being too far from help. Yet, he never allowed the darkness to crush him. In fact, it only sharpened his resolve. He was known for his strength, yes, but it wasn't just his physical strength. It was his mental steel. He was the man who lifted more, worked longer, walked farther. The one who'd carry another man's burden if he had to. He had no riches, no fine clothes, no fancy words. But there was one thing Dashrath Manji had that no one could take away. Fire. A fire that would one day set sparks to stone. But at this point in his life, he didn't know what destiny had planned for him. All he knew was that the mountain took, and took, and took. And something inside him whispered, one day enough. Among the dusty roads of Galar, where life was hard and dreams were often left unspoken, Dashrath Manji found something that made the harsh world feel a little softer. A love that would become his anchor in a sea of struggle. Her name was Falguni Devi. She was a simple woman, like Dashrath, born into the same poverty, raised in the same quiet village. She wasn't rich. She didn't have jewels or fine clothes. But in her eyes, Dashrath found a world more beautiful than anything money could buy. Her love was all-encompassing. Falguni was Dashrath's heart, his strength, and his reason for moving forward. In a world where so much was uncertain, her presence was a quiet promise of peace. When life was too heavy, her smile was the weight that kept him grounded. They had little, a small hut, a few possessions, a life measured in hard work and shared moments. Yet, in their simplicity, there was a wealth that no riches could match, the wealth of love. Together, they worked the fields, they laughed, they argued, and they dreamed small dreams, not of riches or grandeur, but of better days, of health, of peace, and of happiness. A simple life, yet filled with all that mattered. But despite their love, despite their bond, the mountain remained between them and the world they longed to reach. The mountain that separated them from the future, from hope, from possibility. Falguni and Dashrath had one shared vision, a better life, not just for themselves, but for their children, for their village. Together, they faced storms, literal and metaphorical. The wind that blew through their hut at night, the sickness that sometimes fell over them, the hunger that gnawed at their bellies when there was little to eat. Yet, through it all, they had each other. That was enough. For Dashrath, Falguni was not just a companion. She was the reason to keep going. The fire that kept the spark alive when everything else seemed lost. And it was for her, for them, that Dashrath would soon do the impossible. He would go up against a mountain that had stolen so much from them. And he would begin to carve out a way, not just for himself, but for the love they had built together. Because when you have love, even the impossible feels within reach. Every day, Falguni Devi walked the treacherous, narrow path that cut through the mountain. It wasn't a road. It was a trail of suffering, winding over rocks and through thick forests, climbing higher with each step. The path was steep, slippery, and cruel, designed to break the spirits of those who dared to traverse it. But Falguni didn't care about the dangers. She walked with a purpose. Every morning, as the sun rose, she would pick up a simple metal tiffin, a small lunch she had carefully packed for her husband, Dashrath. And then, with a prayer on her lips, she would start the long journey. The path was unforgiving. The mountain's jagged edges threatened to twist an ankle or send her tumbling down the cliffs. There were no handrails, no signs of safety, just rocks that threatened to give way under her feet. Yet, Falguni walked on. For Dashrath, she wasn't afraid of the mountain. She wasn't afraid of the long hours she spent walking alone, far from home. Her mind was focused only on one thing: her husband, working in the fields below, waiting for her. Love gave her courage. The courage to face the storm, the courage to walk through pain, and the courage to move forward no matter the cost. It was a walk of sacrifice. She knew the dangers of the path, the wild animals, the steep drops. Yet, nothing could deter her, not even the heavy rains or the oppressive heat. Every step she took was a quiet act of devotion. With each uphill struggle, she carried a piece of herself toward the man she loved. For him, she endured the bruises, the blisters, the fatigue. And when she arrived at Dashrath, her feet swollen, her clothes torn by the branches that reached out to scratch at her, there was only one thing that mattered: her love, her presence beside him, the food she brought, the moments they shared in silence and in understanding. Her love was not grand gestures or extravagant promises. It was in the small, simple acts, like this daily walk, that spoke volumes. Love is not just spoken. Love is felt in the miles walked, in the burdens carried, in the sacrifices made. As Falguni sat beside Dashrath, offering him the humble meal she had brought, she never complained, never asked for more. Because for her, love wasn't measured in what was gained. It was measured in what was given. And so, every day, the dangerous path became more than just a way to bring food. It became a symbol of the strength of their love. A love that walked far. A love that endured hardship. A love that never turned back. One fateful day, as the sky darkened and the rains began to pour, Falguni Devi set out on her usual trek up the treacherous mountain path. The winds howled, the rocks slick with moisture, and the mountain, once a silent observer of her daily journey, now seemed to conspire against her. The storm, as fierce as it was, didn't stop Falguni. She had walked this path 1,000 times before, each step a testament to her love and her strength. But this time, the mountain was different. The rain soaked through her clothes, and the muddy earth beneath her feet grew slippery, treacherous. As she climbed, one wrong step, just one, sent her sprawling across the rocks. She cried out as her body crashed into the ground, the sharp edges of the stones cutting into her skin. The pain was unbearable. Her breath came in short gasps as she struggled to push herself up. But the mountain was too powerful, too unforgiving. The rocks that once seemed so familiar now felt like cruel hands pulling her down. Falguni tried to call out, but her voice was lost in the rain. And far below, Dashrath, as he worked in the fields, heard nothing. His mind was focused on the crops, until suddenly he felt a deep, gnawing fear, as if the world had shifted beneath him. He turned, and his heart stopped. He saw her, lying motionless on the mountain path. Without a second thought, Dashrath dropped everything and ran. He ran like he had never run before, through the fields, through the pouring rain, his heart pounding in his chest, desperate to reach her. Every step felt heavier than the last. The distance between them seemed to grow longer with each passing moment. When he reached her, it was too late. Falguni's body lay still on the ground, her face pale, her breath shallow. Dashrath cried out her name, his voice breaking through the storm. He knelt beside her, tears streaming down his face, his hands trembling as he tried to shake her awake. "Falguni, please," he begged, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please, wake up." But the mountain had claimed her. There was no doctor, no hospital, no one who could help. The village was too far. The mountain, that very barrier that had kept them apart from the world, had now claimed the life of the woman Dashrath loved. He could only hold her, broken and helpless. In the quiet after the storm, Dashrath's world shattered. The love of his life, the woman who had walked through fire for him, was gone. The mountain had taken more than just a life. It had stolen a future. It had stolen his reason for living. It had stolen hope. And in that moment, Dashrath knew something had to change. He could not, would not, allow this mountain to keep taking what was his. The mountain had broken him, but it had also ignited something in him. And Dashrath Manji, the laborer, the humble man, the husband, would rise from the ashes of his loss. He would move a mountain. As the rain continued to pour, Dashrath Manji sat beside the lifeless body of his beloved Falguni. The world around him seemed distant, drowned out by the roar of the storm. In that moment, nothing mattered except the cold, quiet stillness of the woman who had been his heart, his everything. Her hand was lifeless in his. The warmth that had once radiated from her now gone. Her skin was pale, her body still, and her eyes, those bright eyes that had always looked at him with so much love, were now closed forever. Dashrath's chest heaved with grief, his heart torn in ways words could never describe. The pain was so intense, so overwhelming, that it felt like the very air was suffocating him. The love of his life, the one who had walked across mountains for him, was gone. And for what? For a mountain, for a path that shouldn't have existed. His tears mixed with the rain, streaming down his face as he cradled Falguni in his arms. The reality of the loss cut deep, a wound that no time could heal. But amid the overwhelming sorrow, there was something else, something burning, something that was rising from the depths of his despair. A promise. With her hand still in his, Dashrath whispered, his voice thick with emotion, but steady in its resolve. Never again. His voice cracked, but the determination was clear. I will not let this mountain take another life. He looked up at the massive mountain that had stood between them for so long. The very mountain that had claimed his wife. It loomed over him, cruel and indifferent, a silent witness to his loss. But no longer would it stand as a barrier. No longer would it take. No longer would it claim what was precious. I will break it with my own hands. The words echoed in the rain-soaked silence. But they were not just words. They were a vow born from the deepest pain Dashrath had ever known. As the rain continued to pour, Dashrath Manji sat beside the lifeless body of his beloved Falguni. The world around him seemed distant, drowned out by the roar of the storm. In that moment, nothing mattered except the cold, quiet stillness of the woman who had been his heart, his everything. Her hand was lifeless in his. The warmth that had once radiated from her now gone. Her skin was pale, her body still, and her eyes, those bright eyes that had always looked at him with so much love, were now closed forever. Dashrath's chest heaved with grief, his heart torn in ways words could never describe. The pain was so intense, so overwhelming, that it felt like the very air was suffocating him. The love of his life, the one who had walked across mountains for him, was gone. And for what? For a mountain, for a path that shouldn't have existed. His tears mixed with the rain, streaming down his face as he cradled Falguni in his arms. The reality of the loss cut deep, a wound that no time could heal. But amid the overwhelming sorrow, there was something else, something burning, something that was rising from the depths of his despair. A promise. With her hand still in his, Dashrath whispered, his voice thick with emotion, but steady in its resolve. Never again. His voice cracked, but the determination was clear. I will not let this mountain take another life. He looked up at the massive mountain that had stood between them for so long. The very mountain that had claimed his wife. It loomed over him, cruel and indifferent, a silent witness to his loss. But no longer would it stand as a barrier. No longer would it take. No longer would it claim what was precious. I will break it with my own hands. The words echoed in the rain-soaked silence. But they were not just words. They were a vow born from the deepest pain Dashrath had ever known. As the rain continued to pour, Dashrath Manji sat beside the lifeless body of his beloved Falguni. The world around him seemed distant, drowned out by the roar of the storm. In that moment, nothing mattered except the cold, quiet stillness of the woman who had been his heart, his everything. Her hand was lifeless in his. The warmth that had once radiated from her now gone. Her skin was pale, her body still, and her eyes, those bright eyes that had always looked at him with so much love, were now closed forever. Dashrath's chest heaved with grief, his heart torn in ways words could never describe. The pain was so intense, so overwhelming, that it felt like the very air was suffocating him. The love of his life, the one who had walked across mountains for him, was gone. And for what? For a mountain, for a path that shouldn't have existed. His tears mixed with the rain, streaming down his face as he cradled Falguni in his arms. The reality of the loss cut deep, a wound that no time could heal. But amid the overwhelming sorrow, there was something else, something burning, something that was rising from the depths of his despair. A promise. With her hand still in his, Dashrath whispered, his voice thick with emotion, but steady in its resolve. Never again. His voice cracked, but the determination was clear. I will not let this mountain take another life. He looked up at the massive mountain that had stood between them for so long. The very mountain that had claimed his wife. It loomed over him, cruel and indifferent, a silent witness to his loss. But no longer would it stand as a barrier. No longer would it take. No longer would it claim what was precious. I will break it with my own hands. The words echoed in the rain-soaked silence. But they were not just words. They were a vow born from the deepest pain Dashrath had ever known. In that moment, something inside him changed. The mountain that had seemed so immovable, so impossible, it no longer felt like the end. It felt like the beginning of something far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. Because Dashrath Manji wasn't just going to accept the mountain's rule anymore. He wasn't going to sit by and let it take more lives, more loved ones. He was going to fight. He would carve his way through the mountain. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick, but it would be done. For Falguni, for his village, for every life that had been lost because of this cruel rock that divided them all from the world they deserved. And so, with nothing but his hands, a hammer, and a chisel, Dashrath began what the world would call the impossible. He was no longer just a laborer. He was a man on a mission, a man who would move mountains, literally. The morning after the storm, when the skies had cleared and the sun began to rise over the jagged peaks of the mountain, Dashrath Manji stood alone, facing the very obstacle that had taken everything from him. The mountain, cold and unmoving, loomed before him. Its shadow stretched long across the land, its towering presence reminding him of all that he had lost, of Falguni, of the years of hardship, of the countless lives that had been claimed by its cruel separation. But Dashrath didn't flinch. He didn't back away. There was no hesitation in his heart. This mountain would break. There were no machines, no cranes, no heavy tools that could make the job easier. No team of workers to help him. There was only Dashrath, the laborer, the man who had spent his life working with his hands, the man who would carve a path with nothing but his own strength and willpower. With a hammer in one hand and a chisel in the other, Dashrath walked up to the base of the mountain. The ground beneath his feet was rough, uneven, like the road ahead of him. But his heart was steady. His mind was clear. There was only one thought that drove him now. I will not stop. He raised the hammer high, the weight of it feeling both foreign and familiar in his grip. This was no ordinary task. This was not just a man with a tool. This was a man with a purpose, a man who had known loss, a man who had known pain, and a man who had known how far love could stretch. The first strike came down with all the force he could muster. Thud! The sound echoed through the still morning air, a harsh, defiant noise that rang out against the mountain's indifference. Thud, thud, thud. Each strike was a promise. Each strike was a battle cry. Each strike was a step toward changing his world. The chisel bit into the rock, but the mountain didn't move. It didn't tremble. It didn't acknowledge the man in front of it. It was still, as if daring Dashrath to keep going, daring him to try. But Dashrath's resolve didn't waver. The first few blows were the hardest. The rock was tough, stubborn, unyielding. But Dashrath's arms were strong, and his spirit was unbreakable. He wasn't just fighting against stone. He was fighting against everything that had ever stood in his way. And with every strike, he carved a little more of himself into the mountain. The heat of the day began to press down on him, the sweat pouring from his face, the fatigue threatening to slow his hands. But Dashrath's heart burned brighter than the sun. He was doing this not just for himself. He was doing it for Falguni, for every villager who had suffered, for every life that had been lost to the mountain's cruel grip. The first hammer strike was just the beginning, but it was the moment when the impossible began to feel possible. A simple man with nothing but his hands had begun to change the world. And though no one could see it yet, the mountain would soon learn it had met its match. As Dashrath continued his work, the mountain was relentless. It stood tall and unmoving, seemingly indifferent to the tiny human below it who dared to challenge its might. But Dashrath didn't care. With every strike of the hammer, he carved deeper into the rock, his hands bloodied, his body weary, but his heart unyielding. The first few days, he worked alone. The village, far below the mountain, had no idea what he was doing. But soon, word spread. Curious onlookers, neighbors, friends, even strangers, started to gather at a distance, watching this man who had begun a task so impossible, so absurd, that it seemed laughable. They stood on the edge of the mountain, their voices carrying across the still air. "He's gone mad," one of them chuckled. "Look at him, all alone, thinking he can do the impossible." "A mountain? One man. He'll never make a dent in that thing." Laughter echoed through the crowd, sharp and cruel. Some mocked him openly, while others simply shook their heads in disbelief. "One man can't cut a mountain," they said. The voices of doubt were like stones being thrown at him, each one landing with a sharp sting. They didn't understand. They didn't see the fire in his eyes, the fury in his heart, the promise he had made to Falguni. To them, he was just a laborer, a poor, unimportant man trying to take on a mountain. A joke. But Dashrath didn't listen. He didn't care for their laughter. He didn't care for their doubts. He had heard the mountain's voice long enough. Now, it was time to let his actions speak. With every swing of the hammer, Dashrath shut out the voices. He didn't need their approval. He didn't need their understanding. What he needed was to keep going, to keep striking, to keep moving forward, no matter how much the world mocked him. The mountain might have laughed at him. The world might have laughed at him. But Dashrath didn't mind. He was laughing too, deep inside, where no one could hear. And no matter how many voices mocked him, no matter how many people doubted him, he would keep striking, because he knew something they didn't. The mountain was not invincible. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next, as Dashrath Manji faced the grueling labor of carving his way through the mountain. The mountain didn't care about his pain, his exhaustion, or his suffering. It stood unmoved, as if daring him to try. The work was not easy. It was not quick. It was painful. With every strike of the hammer, the sharp edges of the rocks cut into his hands, leaving deep, raw gashes. His palms bled, his fingers bruised, but he never stopped. The blood mixed with the dust, staining his skin, marking his progress with every painful blow. Dust, thick, choking dust, filled the air, swirling around him with each strike. It clung to his clothes, clogged his throat, and burned his eyes. His vision blurred as he wiped his face with his sleeve. But still, he didn't stop. He couldn't. The sun above showed no mercy. Its harsh rays beat down on him relentlessly, the heat pressing against his skin like a heavy blanket. His sweat mixed with the dirt, making his clothes stick to his body. His muscles screamed for rest. His stomach growled, empty and aching, but Dashrath ignored it. He had no time to eat. He had no time to rest. The mountain had taken enough. Every time he raised the hammer, his body screamed in protest. Every time his chisel bit into the stone, it felt like the mountain was pushing back harder. But Dashrath didn't care. He would not stop. Not for pain, not for hunger, not for exhaustion, not for the sting of the sun or the biting cold at night. He would not stop, because for Dashrath, Every strike was an act of love. Every strike was an act of defiance. Every strike was an act of honoring Falguni, the woman who had walked the mountain for him, the woman who had died because of it. The mountain might have had its claim on the land, but it did not have a claim on his soul. With bloodied hands and burning eyes, Dashrath continued. One strike, another, and another. He was not just breaking the mountain. He was breaking the chains of fate. The sun rose and set, again and again, but one thing never changed: the steady, rhythmic sound of hammer on stone. At first, it was just another strange noise echoing through the hills of Galar, but soon, it became part of the land, a heartbeat of determination that refused to stop. Days became weeks. The villagers watched in confusion. Some shook their heads. Others chuckled at the sight of the lone man chipping away at a mountain. Surely, he would give up soon, but he didn't. Weeks became months. Seasons changed. The rains returned, drenching the valley. Then the dry winds came, blowing dust into every corner of the village. Still, Dashrath worked, soaked, sunburnt, blistered, and bone-tired. And still, he didn't stop. Months became years. Children who once laughed at him began to grow up, their laughter fading into quiet respect. Faces changed. Crops came and went. But one thing remained: Dashrath and the mountain. His hair grew gray, but his hands never slowed. His back bent. There were days when Dashrath swung his hammer with fire in his heart. And there were days when even standing was a struggle. Sometimes there was no food, not because he forgot, but because he had nothing. No grain, no lentils, no warm bread, just cold air and an emptiness that gnawed at his stomach like a wild animal. His hands trembled not just from exhaustion, but from weakness. His lips cracked under the sun, and his body grew thin, bones showing through skin, muscles worn from years of labor. His shirt hung loose on him, threadbare, torn. His sandals gave way, but still, his feet pressed on over stone and dust. Many nights, he lay beneath the stars with nothing in his belly. No bed, no blanket, just earth beneath him and sky above. His stomach growled, but he didn't complain, because in his chest, something else was growing louder than hunger. Hope. Hope that one day, his people wouldn't have to walk 55 kilometers to reach a doctor. Hope that no other wife would die trying to bring food to her husband. Hope that this cruel mountain would no longer divide lives, dreams, and families. He had nothing, and yet he had everything he needed. Because while his body weakened, his purpose grew stronger. The dream of a road through the mountain, carved not by machines, not by a government, but by a man who refused to give up. It kept him going. It kept his heart full even when his stomach was empty. The world saw a poor man, but Dashrath Manji was rich. Rich in will, rich in spirit, rich in belief. And when hunger tried to steal his strength, he fed himself with hope, the kind of hope that can only be born from love, from loss, and from the refusal to let pain win. The mountain could crush his body, but it would never touch his soul. For years, his hammer echoed alone, a lonely rhythm in a world too busy laughing to listen. They had called him mad. They had shaken their heads. They had said, "One man cannot move a mountain." But time has a way of revealing truth. In Dashrath, he had time. He gave it freely, not in hours or days, but in years. The mocking voices began to fade, not all at once, but slowly, like mist retreating in the morning sun. One by one, people stopped laughing. They paused. They stared. Something was changing. The mountain, once untouched, solid, unmoved, was scarred now. Cut, carved, broken, not in dreams, not in drawings, but in stone. Real stone. Chunks of rock lay at Dashrath's feet. A path was forming, not wide yet, not finished, but clear enough for even the most doubtful eyes to see. This was no madness. This was mission. People who once passed by with ridicule now stood silently at a distance, watching the lone figure strike the earth with hands torn and calloused. Their eyes no longer held mockery. They held wonder. Could it be? Could this man, with no money, no support, no machine, actually be doing it? Children who once mimicked him now stood in awe. Elders who once shook their heads now nodded slowly, quietly. Some began bringing him water. Others offered food. A few even stayed to help, just for a moment, to lift a stone, to hold a chisel, to be part of something unbelievable. Dashrath said little. He didn't boast. He didn't turn to the crowd and say, "I told you so." He simply kept working, one strike at a time. Because this wasn't about proving people wrong. It was about proving that one man's will, when rooted in love, loss, and purpose, could shake even the hardest rock. The doubters were fading, but Dashrath's dream? It was just beginning to shine. At first, it was just a crack, barely noticeable to anyone else. A thin line snaking through the rock, like a scar. But to Dashrath, it was everything. It was proof. After years of striking, bleeding, and believing, the mountain had finally begun to break. The dent grew deeper. The ground beneath him began to shift. Where once stood an unbreakable wall of stone, there was now a wound in the mountain's skin, a wound made not by machines, but by the persistence of one man's bare hands. A small tunnel began to form, narrow, dark, uneven. You couldn't walk through it yet, but you could see through it. A sliver of light danced on the other side. It was faint, but it was real. He was no longer just chipping away. He was carving a way through. Dashrath stood inside the opening one evening, his breath heavy, his body shaking from exhaustion. He placed his hand on the rock wall, feeling the cool stone under his blistered skin. The wind, once blocked by the mountain, now whispered through the crack, soft and cool against his face. It was a whisper of victory, a whisper that said, "Yes, you can." Villagers began to notice too. They came closer now, standing at the edge of the path he had carved, no longer skeptical, no longer amused. They leaned in, eyes wide, running their hands along the smooth grooves of the tunnel walls. It was no longer just the dream of one man. It was becoming a reality for everyone. What had once been an impossible wall was now a gateway in progress. And Dashrath, tired, hungry, worn, smiled for the first time in years. Because when a mountain gives way, even just a little, it's not just stone that moves. It's history, it's belief, it's destiny. And Dashrath knew, with every fiber of his being, this mountain would fall, one strike at a time. He had no blueprints, no machines, no maps. There were no engineers guiding his hand, no officials shaking his hand, no news crews telling his story. Dashrath Manji was utterly alone. Day after day, he faced the mountain with nothing but a hammer, a chisel, and a fire in his soul. Not once did a government official arrive to offer support. Not once did a rich man step forward with money. There was no project team, no applause, no one watching over him, except the memory that lived deep within his heart. Falguni, she was gone, but she was with him in every strike. He saw her in the dust that swirled with the wind. He heard her voice in the quiet between hammer blows. When his hands bled, he thought of hers, soft, holding his, years ago. When his knees buckled from hunger, he remembered her walking that cruel path to bring him food. And when the pain became too much to bear, he closed his eyes and saw her smile, and it was enough. He wasn't just cutting through a mountain. He was cutting through grief, through loneliness, through the silence that surrounded a man who had chosen to fight fate with bare hands. People came and went. Some offered kind words. Some stayed to watch. But at the end of the day, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the valley turned to shadows, Dashrath stood alone. No promise of reward, no assurance of success, only the aching of his body and the steady, burning light of purpose. Because some mountains are not made of rock, some are made of sorrow, and Dashrath had vowed to break both. He was a laborer, he was a husband, he was a warrior, not with weapons, but with will. And though the world may not have stood beside him, he stood, still, always, alone. He had no blueprints, no machines, no maps. There were no engineers guiding his hand, no officials shaking his hand, no news crews telling his story. Dashrath Manji was utterly alone. Day after day, he faced the mountain with nothing but a hammer, a chisel, and a fire in his soul. Not once did a government official arrive to offer support. Not once did a rich man step forward with money. There was no project team, no applause, no one watching over him, except the memory that lived deep within his heart. Falguni, she was gone, but she was with him in every strike. He saw her in the dust that swirled with the wind. He heard her voice in the quiet between hammer blows. When his hands bled, he thought of hers, soft, holding his, years ago. When his knees buckled from hunger, he remembered her walking that cruel path to bring him food. And when the pain became too much to bear, he closed his eyes and saw her smile, and it was enough. He wasn't just cutting through a mountain. He was cutting through grief, through loneliness, through the silence that surrounded a man who had chosen to fight fate with bare hands. People came and went. Some offered kind words. Some stayed to watch. But at the end of the day, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the valley turned to shadows, Dashrath stood alone. No promise of reward, no assurance of success, only the aching of his body and the steady, burning light of purpose. Because some mountains are not made of rock, some are made of sorrow, and Dashrath had vowed to break both. He was a laborer, he was a husband, he was a warrior, not with weapons, but with will. And though the world may not have stood beside him, he stood, still, always, alone. He had no blueprints, no machines, no maps. There were no engineers guiding his hand, no officials shaking his hand, no news crews telling his story. Dashrath Manji was utterly alone. Day after day, he faced the mountain with nothing but a hammer, a chisel, and a fire in his soul. Not once did a government official arrive to offer support. Not once did a rich man step forward with money. There was no project team, no applause, no one watching over him, except the memory that lived deep within his heart. Falguni. She was gone, but she was with him in every strike. He saw her in the dust that swirled with the wind. He heard her voice in the quiet between hammer blows. When his hands bled, he thought of hers, soft, holding his, years ago. When his knees buckled from hunger, he remembered her walking that cruel path to bring him food. And when the pain became too much to bear, he closed his eyes and saw her smile, and it was enough. He wasn't just cutting through a mountain. He was cutting through grief, through loneliness, through the silence that surrounded a man who had chosen to fight fate with bare hands. People came and went. Some offered kind words. Some stayed to watch. But at the end of the day, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the valley turned to shadows, Dashrath stood alone. No promise of reward, no assurance of success, only the aching of his body and the steady, burning light of purpose. Because some mountains are not made of rock, some are made of sorrow, and Dashrath had vowed to break both. He was a laborer, he was a husband, he was a warrior, not with weapons, but with will. And though the world may not have stood beside him, he stood, still, always, alone. More than 10 years had passed, 10 years of sweat, blood, and silence. 10 years of waking before the sun and sleeping beneath the stars. 10 years of swinging the hammer, stone after stone, strike after strike. And then finally, a path appeared. It wasn't wide, it wasn't smooth, but it was real. A narrow stretch of broken stone now ran through the heart of the mountain, like a scar carved by determination. You could walk through it if you were careful, single file, with arms outstretched to touch both sides of the rock. Children were the first to try. They laughed as they tiptoed through the tunnel. What was once a wall that loomed over them had now become a passage beneath their feet. No more climbing sharp rocks. No more walking for hours around the mountain. They could now pass through, because one man believed they should. The villagers followed. Elders, limping slowly, rested their hands on the stone walls, whispering prayers. Young men stared in disbelief. Mothers held their babies and smiled through tears. The mountain was losing, and the world was beginning to notice. Not newspapers, not governments, but the people, the ones who mattered most. They no longer asked, "Why is he doing this?" They began to ask, how did what was once seen as madness was now seen as miracle? But it wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was the result of thousands of lonely days, of pain endured quietly, of love carried endlessly, of faith so stubborn, even stone couldn't stop it. Dashrath stood at the entrance of his creation, watching children run where rock once ruled. And he smiled, not because he was finished, but because he knew the mountain had finally begun to break. Every strike took a toll, every swing of the hammer, every chisel through rock. It was never easy. And though Dashrath's spirit remained strong, his body was another story. He broke bones, not just small ones, but ribs, fingers, his leg. The mountain didn't care. It didn't pause for him to heal. It didn't slow down for his pain. It just stood there, cold and unmoving. And every time he took a step forward, the mountain demanded another toll. Sometimes he stumbled and fell, the weight of exhaustion and injury too much to bear. He would collapse on the rocky ground, his body screaming in protest. His chest would heave in pain as he lay there, sometimes for hours, unable to move. But no matter how many times he fell, no matter how much it hurt, Dashrath always stood again. Each time he broke, he rebuilt himself. The villagers began to see him differently. They no longer saw just the man who fought a mountain. They saw a man who fought himself. A man who would rise, no matter how many times the world knocked him down. When he was sick with fever, trembling with chills, he still carried his hammer. When his bones were bruised and battered, he still picked up his chisel. When his hands were too swollen to grip, he wrapped them in cloth and kept going. Because in his heart, Dashrath knew something no one else did. The mountain might be stubborn, but he was more. Every injury was just another test. Every fall was just another lesson. The mountain could break his bones, but it couldn't break his will. And with every moment of pain, Dashrath's resolve grew stronger, not because the mountain was easy to defeat, but because he believed, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that no matter what, he would win. For 15 long years, Dashrath Manji battled the mountain. Day after day, year after year, the fire inside him never dimmed. It only grew brighter, stronger, hotter. He fought the rock with a hammer, with a chisel, with nothing but his hands, his heart, and a relentless belief that one man could change everything. For 15 years, the mountain was his only enemy and his only companion. It stood tall, unyielding, mocking his every strike. But Dashrath? He never stopped. The villagers had long since stopped laughing. Some began to call him a saint, a man touched by something divine, a force of nature who had come to change their lives. They spoke of him in hushed tones, revering him like a legend that grew taller with each passing day. But there were others who still called him crazy. Why, they asked. Why waste your life on this? What's the point? They couldn't understand. They didn't see the mountain for what it was. They didn't feel the deep ache in his heart. the ache that was more than just pain. It was a promise. Dashrath didn't care what they said. He didn't care if they called him mad. He didn't care if they doubted him or if they revered him. What mattered was that he had made a vow to the woman he loved, a vow to the people of Galar, a vow to himself. He had come too far to stop now. The world might say what it wanted. The world might see him as a saint or a fool. But Dashrath knew one thing the world didn't. A mountain can't stand against a man who refuses to back down. For 15 years, his hands were bloodied. His back was broken. His body was bruised. For 15 years, he had faced fire, the fire of pain, of loss, of isolation, of doubt. But he had never once let it burn him. Instead, he used it. He used the fire to keep going. The mountain was still standing, but with every passing year, it was losing its strength, losing its power. Because Dashrath had something stronger than rock. He had fire, and it was burning through everything in his path. After 15 years of solitary struggle, something began to change. The mountain, once unmoved by one man's will, was now beginning to feel the weight of something else, belief. And belief, like the slow drip of water, can carve through even the hardest stone. It started with just a few. A neighbor, a farmer, a woman with calloused hands who had watched Dashrath from the distance for years. They came one by one, hesitant at first, unsure if they should join this madman, this saint, this fool. But when they saw the path, the narrow tunnel cutting through the rock, something stirred inside them. A spark, a connection, a belief that if he could do it, maybe they could, too. And so, the first hands joined the labor. One hammer, then another, one pickaxe, then a few. The sound of work that had once been the rhythm of one man's fight was now the chorus of a village awakening. It wasn't much at first. A few extra hands didn't make the tunnel wider overnight. But every strike, every swing of the hammer, added a little more strength to the effort. The mountain, once so proud, now began to feel the pressure of many. The power of belief was spreading like wildfire. It reached the hearts of the people. What had started as a single, stubborn dream was now becoming a collective vision. Dashrath, ever the quiet man, watched as the villagers began to follow his lead. He didn't ask for help. He never did. But now he didn't need to. The mountain was no longer just his fight. It was the village's fight. It was everyone's battle against the odds. And as the villagers worked, they understood something deeper. It wasn't just about breaking through stone. It was about breaking through doubt. With every blow, with every crack in the rock, they weren't just carving a road. They were carving a future. And that future was no longer just Dashrath's. It belonged to them all. The sound of hammers and chisels became a familiar melody. What had once been a narrow crack in the stone had slowly grown wider. The mountain that had stood as an unmovable giant, blocking lives, hope, and progress, was now yielding. What began as a small passage, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, slowly began to widen. The stone that once felt impervious to change now felt fragile, as if it too had finally realized that it was not invincible. The villagers worked side by side, not just for their own benefit, but for the future they could now see taking shape before them. The road was no longer just a crack, a tunnel. It was a path of possibility, a path of life. The path widened enough for carts to pass through, for farmers to drive their goods to market, for children to run freely to the schools they'd never been able to reach, for families to be reunited, for everything that had been held back by the mountain to finally move forward. No longer was the mountain a wall. It was a way to something greater, a way to the world beyond. And as the last of the stone was chipped away, Dashrath stood at the edge of the road, watching the carts roll through for the first time. A quiet smile crossed his weathered face, but there was no boastful pride. It wasn't a victory he needed to announce. The road spoke for itself. The mountain had been defeated, not by the strength of 1,000 men, but by the determination of one man who refused to stop. The mountain, in all its weight, had not been a wall that could hold him back. It had only been a challenge, a test. And now, it was part of the past. The road that once led nowhere now led everywhere. Dashrath Manji had moved a mountain, but more than that, he had made a way. After decades of swinging his hammer under the burning sun and sleeping beneath the stars, the government finally noticed. Officials came. They walked the road he had carved with his bare hands. They looked at the broken mountain, at the path wide enough for carts, for children, for dreams, and they were amazed. Cameras flashed. Papers were signed. They praised Dashrath, calling him a hero, a visionary, a man of the people. They offered support, cement, tools, labor, all the things he had asked for years ago when no one listened. But by then, Dashrath had already done the work. The mountain was broken. The road was real. He had done it without them, without machines, without money, without permission. He had fought with nothing but love and rage and purpose. Now they came with promises and headlines. But he didn't need applause. He wasn't chasing fame. All he ever wanted was a way through the mountain, a way to a better life for his village. And while the recognition came late, his heart remained humble. Dashrath welcomed the help, but deep inside, he knew the hardest part was never breaking stone. It was believing when no one else did. After 22 long years, the hammer fell silent. What began as grief, what burned as rage, what endured as love, had finally become a road. Dashrath Manji stood at the edge of his creation, a path carved not just through rock, but through doubt, pain, and impossibility. The mountain that once mocked him now lay split in two, defeated not by force, but by sheer, unshakable will. The journey had cost him everything: blood, health, time, but he had never asked for anything in return. Now, the children could walk to school, the sick could reach hospitals, the villagers could trade, connect, and live freely. What once took 55 kilometers of walking around the mountain could now be crossed in minutes, right through it. The mountain had surrendered, and Dashrath, the man they once laughed at, had become something more than a legend. He had become proof that love, fueled by purpose, can break even the hardest stone. He didn't weep. He didn't boast. He simply looked at the road, dirt on his hands, fire still in his eyes, and smiled. News of Dashrath's impossible achievement began to spread. He was no longer just a man with a hammer. He was a symbol of unshakable will. They called him a national hero. He was invited to speak. Awards were given. Politicians shook his hand. But Dashrath remained the same: simple, humble, grounded. He didn't wear pride like a medal. He wore it quietly, like the dust on his feet. Despite the recognition, he didn't stop working. He began asking the government to build a proper road, a hospital, a school, not for him, but for his people. Even after breaking the mountain, his mission continued, to lift others up. But the years of toil had taken their toll. His body grew weak. The fire still burned, but the frame that carried it had grown tired. Eventually, Dashrath Manji fell ill. In 2007, he passed away, not as the poor laborer from a forgotten village, but as the man who had moved a mountain with love, grief, and grit. Yet, even in death, he remained alive in the spirit of his people. His story became legend. His name was carved into the heart of India. Children now walk freely through the path he made. Wheels roll where once only bare feet dared. And when people face the impossible, they remember him. Not because he was the strongest, not because he had the best tools, but because he had something most people forget. Dashrath Manji showed the world that one person, one ordinary person, can do the extraordinary. Not by shouting, not by waiting, but by doing. So if you ever stand before a mountain, something that feels too big, too hard, too impossible to change, remember the man who struck stone for 22 years and whisper what he once did: I will not stop. I will not let this mountain win. Because the truth is, mountains move when hearts refuse to. They called him mad. They called him weak. But in the end, they called him Mountain Man. Dashrath Manji showed the world, you don't need money to make change. You need purpose. You don't need an army to move mountains. You need heart. Today, thousands walk the road he carved with love. And every step they take whispers his message. Nothing is impossible when your why is strong enough. Dashrath Manji, not just a name, but a reminder that even a single soul can shape history. If this story moved you, imagine what you can move. Share this video to honor Dashrath Manji's legacy. Like it if you believe one person can change the world. Subscribe for more true stories that inspire the soul. And remember, the next mountain might be yours to move.